Hello everybody! This game I am about to show you was played in 1913 between two world champions. The white pieces were played by Capablanca and Alekhine had the black pieces. And this game is going to be about how to play with isolated pawns. And the game started with d4, d5, c4, c6. So here we have a Slav, the kind of basic starting position for a Slav, which is quite solid for black. Black generally is kind of holding back for a little while, not playing too aggressively, but is playing positionally and doesn't really have any weaknesses. So the exchange Slav, which would be c4 takes d5 and then c6 takes d5, is seen as extremely likely to be a draw because the position is now symmetrical. So Capablanca instead plays e3, knight f6 is played, knight f3, e6. So again, the position is practically symmetrical except white's c-pawn is advanced further than black's c-pawn. Knight bd2 and knight bd7 are played. Bishop d3, and Alekhine now plays bishop e7, so breaking the the symmetry. And here, I think a very sensible move is now played, just castle. Alekhine also castles. So the battle here is going to be over the centre because the king, both sides on the king side are perfectly okay. There's no real weakness around the pawn structure. And when you've castled on the same side, normally there's not going to be any devastating attacks or pawn storms coming up in the near future. So Capablanca just keeps developing with queen c2. So having a slight pressure on h7, but nothing yet that's very significant. Black now takes, and the reason for this is a very common theme in the Slav. If white takes with the bishop or the queen, so let's say the bishop, black can now engineer what's called a pawn break. The thing is that the pawns on e6 and c6, while being defensive, are restricting the bishop on c8. So usually, at the proper moment, black wants to move one of those pawns to give some air to the bishop. And here, I think that c5 can now be played. And black could play b6, bishop c7, but the other possibility is to play something like knight b6 and then bishop d7 to c6. So that's the sort of general idea of a pawn break. So bishop takes d7 was c4 wasn't played. Instead, knight takes c4 was played. So black still manages to get in the pawn break. There isn't really a way to prevent it. And here, knight c to e5 was played. So white again has a supported knight on e5, so it's in black's half of the board, and it is putting slight pressure on black's position. And now black plays c takes d4. So here, if white captures the knight, black will happily capture it with the bishop. And then after white takes on d4, black can play something like rook c8 or queen b6, and I think black should be perfectly fine there. Instead, white takes with the e pawn here, Obviously, knight takes d4 is terrible because knight takes e5 just wins a piece. So e takes, and now there is an imbalance to the position. Black has a pawn on e6, which is helping out the kingside pawn structure. It's a perfectly fine pawn structure to have. And in terms of just the structure of the pawns, if we were to imagine every other piece has vanished, except for the kings, White has a slight weakness in terms of pawn structure because he has an isolated queen's pawn. And as I might have said before in a couple of videos, this is both a positive and a negative in terms of how the position develops. On the negative side, Black's plan is to blockade the pawn by controlling the square in front of it. The most common thing to do is to place a knight onto the square in front of the pawn, and then put pressure on the pawn by attacking it with the other pieces, and usually putting rooks on the d file would be a key theme here. So that's Black's idea, and what White is planning to do is the dynamic of the d4 and e6 pawns is that White's pawn is more advanced and is controlling squares in Black's camp. So White will have more space to maneuver the pieces and can generally gain an initiative and possibly put pressure on Black's position to gain compensation for the slight difference in pawn structure. So after knight b6, the two knights are aiming at d5, which does stop another one of White's ideas, which is if White can gain more space, later White might be able to push the pawn to d5 and exchange pawns on d5 and e6. So then there'd be no difference in pawn structure, and White would keep the initiative and the space advantage. So here, knight g5 is played. So White's really using pieces very, very aggressively. And Black's already in a little bit of trouble here. Can anyone see what is wrong with h6? I'll give you 10 seconds to find what is wrong with h6. What does White play? Well, the pawn structure's fine, but that isn't really going to help you because you're going to get mated. Bishop h7 check, and if knight takes, queen takes, mate. So king h8, and then in either order you can play knight e or knight g takes f7 check, rook takes, other knight takes, checkmate, because the queen is still guarding the bishop. So that would be rather embarrassing. So Alekhine didn't want to get mated this quickly. And instead of h6, the best move, which does look quite ugly, is g6, blocking the queen and bishop's line to h7. Now the unfortunate thing here is that Black has weakened a lot of dark squares around his king, and the bishop on e7 would probably prefer to be on g7 here, fianchettoing and guarding all the dark squares. But after knight g to f3, it will be quite a long and slow process to play rook e8, bishop f8, bishop g7, and White could quite possibly be able to use pieces very, very effectively and gain an initiative in the center. So the rather odd move, king g7, is played. I probably wouldn't have played this if I was Alekhine, but I'm not Alekhine, so what do I know? So bishop g5 is now played. It's a good move, I can't see anything wrong with it. And Here I would have probably played h6 instead of knight b d5. I just would have wanted to try and exchange and get rid of the bishop and solve a few problems on the dark squares. But again, Alekhine doesn't play that. He plays knight b d5, so blockading and bringing the piece that was on the queen side to the king side. So he's recognizing that all the action, all the activity is on the king side, so he needs pieces there. Rook a c1 was now played, so seizing control of the c file. Finally, black moves the bishop and completes development with bishop d7. Queen d2 was now played, so it's allowing the rook to control the c file. And what's the other threat with queen d2? Yeah, for those of you who have been playing chess a while, there's a common theme of the queen and bishop on g5 lining up to play bishop h6. And normally the reason for that is that instead of a king, black has a bishop on g7, and it will favourably exchange bishops because the bishop on g7 is going to be controlling the long diagonal and more of the centre than white's bishop. And with the removal of those bishops, black's king side can become very weak on the dark squares, because black's bishop was more important in controlling the squares than white's bishop was in attacking them. So the theme, the bishop h6 skewering the king and rook is the threat. So here I would have played rook e8. This wasn't what was played in the game, but just to show how this could transform the position. Bishop h6 anyway, check. King g8. And the rather annoying move, which white would probably do here, would be knight g5, hitting f7. Bishop b4. And then probably queen e2, but queen d1 is also okay. And now I would have played rook e8. And here, I don't think it would be a good idea to take on f7, giving up your two knights for the rook and pawn, because even though the pawn structure for black is a little weak, there shouldn't be any devastating attacks. So in terms of material, it will be 6 points each, let's say, that have resulted in the exchange on f7, but I always prefer to have more pieces than pawns, so I feel like the rook could quite easily get overpowered by black's two knights. Anyway, this isn't what was played. This is just a possible position that could have resulted from the game. Going back, instead, what was played was knight g8. And what I don't like is the reason that bishop h6 is normally played. Here, all of black's kingside pawns are on light squares, so the bishop is really important in defending and controlling the dark squares. And what black has done is just allowed white to exchange. So now black is weak on the dark squares on the king side. And here I do not understand Alekhine's move. Queen takes e7 was played, but if I were him, I would have played knight g takes e7, because the knight on g8 isn't exactly doing very much, and it's undeveloped, so you may as well redeploy it and have all your pieces developed again. And the queen being on d8 isn't such a big deal. You can play queen b6 if you need to, or queen a5 if the white queen were to not be on d2. Also, you could play knight e7 to f5 or c6, and then queen to e7. So I don't understand queen takes e7, because the knight on g8 isn't really being used. You could argue, though, that knight f6 is going to be played, so it's not such a big deal, but just intuitively it doesn't look right. bishop e4 was now played. So what white is trying to do is take on d5, and then black will have to recapture with the pawn, and then the pawn structure will be identical. Both sides will have an isolated pawn on the queen side, and that takes away black's advantage of saddled white with an isolated pawn. Actually, I take back what I said about the position with the pawns being identical, because black will still have weakened dark squares around the king side, and white's pawn structure on the king side is unmoved and has no weaknesses. So this is the idea, and bishop b5 was now played. So I do get it. The idea is to develop the bishop and attack white's rook, but now white simply develops the rook, so black's kind of helped with white's development. And now, again, I've spoken about this in other videos, and you may think I'm just harping on about it, and it isn't really that important, but I think it's hugely important in this kind of position. What white has done is put his rook on the e file instead of the d file, and the reason for that is that, one, he's got an open file on the e file, that makes more sense, but also he has put his rook on the same line as black's queen, and there could be so many tactics that result from this. The knight on e5 could move and do a discovered attack, which is perfectly possible, and also the e-pawn is now, in a way, it's pinned, so perhaps the knight on d5 might be able to be taken without fear of recapture. So there's a lot of elements that have just been introduced, and it puts a lot of pressure onto black's position, which is why I think black makes a terrible mistake. Queen d6. I hate this move, absolutely hate it. What do you think I would have done? Not that I'm better than Alekhine, but what do you think I would have done instead of Queen d6? Or what would you play instead of Queen d6? Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. For goodness sake, just redeploy your knight. What's the knight on g8 doing? Nothing. So put it on f6, and now if bishop takes knight, knight takes. So you don't need to take with the e-pawn, and there are now no tactics on the queen on e7. And here I might well argue that black is now better, because white doesn't really have enough pieces to do a huge attack, and that way the weaknesses on the dark squares can't really be exploited. So in a weird sort of philosophical way, they're not really weaknesses if they can't be taken advantage of, and black still has the favourable pawn structure. So I would have played that, and white would probably have had, after knight g f6, white might have had to retreat the bishop. Again, this isn't, maybe white is slightly better here after, say, bishop c2, or maybe even something else, but I'd like this much more for black than Queen d6, because how can white gain an advantage here? How can white improve the position? Yeah, bishop takes d5. And here, if black plays queen takes d5, maintaining the blockade, what does white do here? Yeah, white wins a piece, rook c5. There's no way to defend the bishop, so here white's just completely won. Rook a5 is being threatened, as well as rook takes b7. So yeah, what black had to do was not take with the queen was take with the pawn. So now white has successfully uh, what's the word? Yeah, successfully taken away black's only advantage, which was white having a worse pawn structure in the center on the sort of on d4. So now black has the worst pawn structure. Black has no potential advantage here, no long-term endgame sort of advantage, and white has active rooks on the two open files, a knight on e5 that's being supported by another knight, and it's controlling lots of light squares, and black has something I'll do a video on later, a bad bishop, which is his bishop doesn't really have any targets, but I'll explain more in the next video on bad bishops. And also the knight's not developed still, so white's pieces are way better, and white has successfully managed to use the isolated pawn to gain an advantage. So queen a5 was played. So once you have a slight advantage and better pieces, keep on the initiative. Don't play passively from here. Keep attacking. So again, what I would do is I would close off the open C file. I feel like that's asking for trouble. And here I might have to sacrifice a pawn, but it could well be the best option. Knight takes, pawn takes, rook e2 is what I would do here. Maybe I would try and challenge white on the e file. Knight e5, I'm going for the pawn, rook c8, rook e to c2, knight g to knight e7, queen a4. And here I think black does just have to give up a pawn. And here, now the pawn structure is identical. And black does have a slight, maybe a very, very small initiative due to the fact that the queen and rook are lined up on the e file, so they're more coordinated. So queen b4 could be played as well as queen e2 or queen e1 check. But white is a pawn up, so I think black doesn't have enough compensation for the pawn. This may be difficult to win, though, for white, but again, I think this is a lot better than the position in the game in terms of black's chances of drawing here. Going back. So again, we reach here. I play bishop c6, but instead a6 was played. And now, infiltration, queen c7. And yeah, I just I just don't know what to say now. I mean, black's position is just getting worse and worse. Queen takes, rook takes, and now white has pressure on f7. So I would watch out for this, and I think the move I would play would be rook a e8 again, so pinning the knight on e5 to the rook on e1. And there might be a chance here for black to create something, but it still isn't a very nice position. I might just swap off and go a pawn down, and it is still hard to win this for white. So I would just sort of grin and bear it and just prevent any more initiative from white. So that is my plan. But in the game, what was played was h6. So it's preventing knight g5 that would be attacking f7. So I can see the logic behind it. But you're just not activating any of your pieces. The two rooks haven't moved yet, unless you count castling. And the knight, in a way, even though it has moved, the knight has gone to a position where it looks like it hasn't moved. And the bishop on b5 just doesn't seem to be doing very much, whereas white's pieces are all very active. So rook takes b7, winning a pawn. Rook a to c8, finally activating the rook. b3. So cutting down the bishop's options and also getting the pawns off of the 7th rank. Rook c2, a4. So now white's rook is defending the b pawn, backward b pawn, and the pawn is defending the a4 pawn. So white doesn't have any pawns that can be picked off. And now the bishop can either go to a very unhappy place with bishop e8, which would lock in the rook and put all the pieces, basically, apart from the rook on c2, into the most passive-looking position you can imagine. But instead, bishop e2 was played, trying to swap off, and knight h4. So white realizes that his pieces are better, so why exchange? And also that the pawn on g6 is undefended, pretty much. Only the king can capture anything because the pawn on f7 is pinned. So white now has two pieces attacking g6. Black only has one piece defending it. And it's very unpleasant. Again, I know I keep saying this, but it's true. It's just so hard to defend. And Alekhine now plays h5. And I'm not sure I totally get this move. I think the idea might be knight h6 next move, defending f7, and then being able to move the rook on f8, but that's only a guess. I'm not sure what was going through his mind, because knight h takes g6, rook e8, rook takes f7. So I think here that Alekhine might have just not seen that his pawn was pinned. And now this is just a disaster. King h6, f4. So here there's lots of sort of mating ideas because the black king can't move. And after a5, just trying to lock down white's pawns and make the advantage in pawns less, because one pawn is tying down two pawns on the queen side. White now plays knight h4. So what's the threat here? If white had an extra move, what would white play? Yeah, knight f5 is coming. So Alekhine, unfortunately, gives up the exchange, and white now recaptures, giving himself a protected passed pawn. So even in terms of the endgame, if all the pieces were removed except for the kings, white would win easily. But we're not there yet, unfortunately. So king g5 is now played. And there are two good moves here. One is rook g7 check. King takes knight, rook takes knight, and the king is just unable to move. And white can just chuck the e-pawn up, which, if I'm honest, I would have done this because it's just so much easier to play, and I don't really need to calculate anything because my rook is on the e-file anyway, so I'll just play rook g7, king takes, rook takes, and it just doesn't really matter what black plays. Bishop g4, e6, and unless black wants to give up the bishop for the pawn, I'm just going to make a queen. So here, with two rooks up, I don't really need to calculate this much. I think black will resign in the next few moves. So I would have done that, but instead, Capablanca played a move which is equally good according to the computer, g3. So the threat is still active. And there's also checkmate with rook g7. So it's both checkmate and it's threatening to win the knight. And the only move I could see that seemed to save black, at least temporarily, was king h6. And it's still bad, but at least black can survive for a little longer. But in the game, king g4 is now played. And rook g7 check. So here, I think maybe the idea was to have an active king, maybe try and swindle white by weaving a kind of mating net around him. But after king h3, which was the only move, how did white finish the game off? White's next move forced black to resign here. Can you find what black played? I'll give you 20 seconds to find the move. Yeah, if you spotted it, excellent. Knight g2 resigns because the threat is knight f4 checkmate, and black doesn't have a single move that stops it. Every single move black plays, white will do knight f4 checkmate. So I thought this was a very interesting game, and particularly the early middle game and out of the opening was very, very useful. Just to go back and see the very beginning. So again, we start with the Slav, which is very hard to break down for white. White's trying to win, obviously, and generally black can win. Black has winning chances, but the Slav is kind of associated with a solid position where it's very hard for white to gain much. But Capablanca did expertly with developing, always useful. And what he did, what Alekhine did, which I'm not sure I would have done, but maybe I would have done, is perhaps he could have just sat there and after knight takes, he could perhaps have tried to put his knights on d5 and say f6 and just tried to be really, really solid. But instead he played a little actively, which is good, with c5. And then we reached an imbalance in the position. And again, white has to play actively, use the pieces, and gain the space advantage to prove that his piece play is more important than the pawn structure. Because before the end game, you have the middle game. And I felt that, for example, here, I might have just taken the knight. And if white wants to try and prove that his pieces are better, it's going to be very hard because he'll repair the pawn structure with pawn takes. But again, white has the whoops, no, sorry, wrong move order here. When was I going to? Okay, so okay, knight b6. Okay, no, I'm wrong. I had thought that the queen was on d2 for some reason. Okay, my mistake. Never mind. But yeah, after knight b6, white has been able to use his pieces to create problems. And then, like I always like to do, create threats while developing the pieces. And here black just went wrong under the pressure with, again, rook e8 would have been an interesting line, but even knight g8 is fine as long as you bring your knight back into play. And then it might have been harder for white to win this. But again, knight gf6 would have been better. Here, knight gf6 would have been fine for black. But white putting black under so much pressure this early in the game did cause him to go wrong. And then at the right moment, white doesn't need to keep the pawn structure the way it is because his pawn structure is worse. So taking it off and then keeping the initiative. So, and then you know the rest from here. But I thought Alekhine didn't play this particularly well, but Capablanca played this absolutely fantastically, using his pieces so well. Anyway, I hope you liked the video. Hope you got some tips on how to play when you have isolated pawns. Comment, like, subscribe, or all three, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.